Greetings, history lovers. Welcome to History Changes on YouTube. I'm Dr. Philip W. Travis. Please subscribe to my channel if you're interested in history, whether it is ancient history. I have a lot of travel history videos, as well as more current or more modern history types of things. My specialty is the United States in the Cold War, so a little bit more of the modernist here, but I do all kinds of different history videos. So if you enjoy history, I try to make these as frequently as I can, and I try to make them as relevant to us as I can. So please subscribe to History Changes on YouTube. This topic today, this video today, engages what I imagine is probably one of the most asked questions over the last few years, and that is, why does the United States support Ukraine in its war against Russia? And of course you see one of the more infamous pictures of the February 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. There's a number of different ways to think about this subject, and this lecture is not to say how you should feel about it. It's just simply to provide us with some historical understanding of why the United States supports Ukraine as one example of a country that it supports in the world against Russia. And we're going to look at this from a historical standpoint. So there's a number of different ways that people can look at this, and this is a widely discussed topic. There are conversations in the highest offices of government, obviously, in the United States about this very subject. Of course, Ukraine aid is a matter of oftentimes debate and controversy in the U.S. Congress, and it's an ongoing debate amongst specialists as well, international relations specialists, about what role the United States should or should not be playing here. So I want to think a little bit, get us to think a little bit about this through a historical lens. So, and I should say, too, that thinking about why the United States supports Ukraine from a longer historical perspective will also answer questions like, why does the United States have such a huge defense budget? Here you have, rather basic graph that I put together to give us an idea about the scale of the United States defense budget, which today is pushing close to $1 trillion. Which is, of course, larger, as you see from the graph. It's substantially larger, by more than double, than China, much larger than Russia's defense budget, and the next 10 countries combined, it's larger than that, too. So the historical understanding of why the United States supports Ukraine will also help to provide answers to why the United States today has such a large defense budget. It will also provide answers to, or insight, I should say, into why the United States has so many military bases around the world. This map that I created shows you roughly all of the countries in which the United States has military bases. And the United States maintains, it fluctuates to some degree, maintains roughly 700 overseas military bases. The island of Okinawa itself, located in the Ryukyu Islands down here, on Okinawa, there's several military bases just on the island of Okinawa. And so thinking about the subject, too, why? And there's a lot of, I think, there are other ways to look at this as opposed to the way that I'm going to suggest we think about this. Certainly, some historians will look at this, and the lens of critique will be the United States as an informal sort of neo-imperial country, as an informal empire. And that's not necessarily an incorrect way to look at this. But I want us to think about this more just through the details of history and the experiences of the United States before we get into sort of thinking about the United States from the standpoint of being a modern informal empire vying against other imperial states like China or Russia, for example. The reason the United States is involved in Ukraine, the reason the United States has a massive military budget, the reason the United States has bases all over the world, it comes largely from, the Munich Conference of 1938, These are the so-called lessons of Munich. World War II was the event that really catapulted the United States onto the world stage. It's when the United States accepted, if you will, the baton of being a world leader. It was really had that opportunity at the end of World War I, but it wasn't prepared to accept that at the end of World War I. People have to understand that being a world power, a country with bases all over the world, a country that has territories, a country with the most advanced, powerful military in the world, a country that the world often turns to in times of need, and a country with significant power that can be used in some cases for positive ends, power that can be used for very negative ends. That's a new thing in American history. Not until the 20th century was the United States that kind of a country. And it's really not until the post-World War II period where the United States really fully accepts a role as a world power. So what are the lessons of Munich? Okay, so the Munich Conference, you see, of course, the famous or infamous, it's really infamous, photo here of the Munich Conference. Of course, Neville Chamberlain over here, obviously Hitler over here, Mussolini. The Munich Conference was this conference, of course, in 1938, as the Nazi military war machine was really preparing to conquer Europe. And, you know, the Rhineland had been annexed, the Austria had been annexed, or the Rhineland wasn't annexed, it was remilitarized. So some of these areas that had been sort of taken away from Germany in a de facto sense after World War I, the Rhineland was made a demilitarized zone. The Saar was effectively removed from Germany. Germany, after the Nazis come to power, almost immediately they pull out of the League of Nations. They begin rearming. They bring the Saar back into Germany. They remilitarize the Rhineland. They create naval agreements with Great Britain. All the while this is happening, you know, France is wary. The world is kind of shaking its finger a little bit, but unwilling to do anything about it. In 1938, Nazi Germany would annex Austria, meddling in the Austrian politics ultimately to an extent where they were able to annex the country. And in the fall of 1938, that year culminates in this event, the Munich Conference. In Czechoslovakia, which is today the Czech Republic and Slovakia, there's this region on the border of Germany, near Bavaria, known as the Sudetenland. Hitler had claimed the people living in the Sudetenland were true ethnic Germans, that they should be, remember, Nazi Germany crafted citizenship around the idea that a person's ethnicity and race was the thing that made them a part of the country. Right, so being German, and so Hitler said, well, these are the Sudetenland people are German people, and they have been unjustly taken away from Germany following the treaties of World War I, and Hitler demands that basically that the international community or the European community acknowledge the reincorporation of the Sudetenland people into Germany, that they'd be allowed to annex this. And of course, you know, what happens, and this is the story really of the appeasement, what happens is the British and the French, they go to the area, they meet with Hitler, they have these conferences. The Czech delegations were not even allowed in the room, and it should also be noted that should the Czechs have wanted to fight for it, and that was the threat, Hitler said, if you don't do this, then we'll invade Czechoslovakia. The Sudetenland is a rugged region, it's a mountainous region, it was defensible, but the Czechs weren't allowed to really be part of the part of the conversation. And the British, of course, famously, or infamously, again, it's not famous, it's infamous, they negotiated with Hitler and gave Hitler the Sudetenland. And Neville Chamberlain flies back to Great Britain and says he has achieved peace in our time, in one of the most one of the maybe the most substantial blunders in history because, of course, a year later, the the Nazi stormtroopers, were invading Poland. And even less than a year of that, they were occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia, areas like Bohemia and Moravia, in their preparation for conquest of Europe and what they wanted to create, a racially German empire that effectively would render all sort of non-German people to the level of serfdom, servanthood or slavery in Europe. So from that, the United States, is all that was going on. The United States was an isolationist power. And the lessons of Munich for the United States is the consequences of isolationism. It was an isolationist power. And there are strong isolationist trends in the United States in the 21st century, to a large degree because of how people have reacted to highly unpopular and controversial wars in the 21st century. The war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. However, the lessons of Munich for American statespeople really demonstrated the flaws of isolationism. The United States had, in the 1930s, had effectively no meaningful military. It was in no way prepared to fight any kind of a meaningful war. It had effectively dismantled any of its meaningful international arrangements and connections that it had developed in the 1920s following World War I, and was basically taking the line of, we have this big ocean here, so we're not really concerned with Europe. In fact, in the 1930s, the United States made it a point, as everyone sees what's going on with Nazi Germany, the radicalism of Nazi Germany was not a mystery. Folks knew about this. Okay, folks knew about concentration camps. Concentration camps were started in Nazi Germany from day one. And so people knew about the radicalism of Nazi Germany. But the United States insisted in the 1930s it was not going to do anything about this. It passed neutrality declarations. It passed things like the Johnson Debt Default Act, which basically said that the United States would provide no aid or support to any country in need in Europe until they had fully paid their World War I debts. And so the United States was dug into this isolationism. The ramifications of that were that the United States was unprepared, unwilling, and unable to do anything to stop the atrocity that becomes the Second World War until really the scale of the calamity was assured. The involvement of the United States comes at such a point. Remember, the United States does not become meaningfully involved until 1941 with Lend-Lease in March of 1941, and then, of course, following Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. Until that year, the United States is not really doing anything of real significance. So the United States sits idly by while it watches the conquest of effectively all of Western and much of Eastern Europe. Doesn't really do anything about it. As the Blitz was happening in London in 1940, the United States did very little to support that. The United States watched France fall in 6 weeks in 1940 to Nazi Germany and did nothing about it. And so when the United States became involved and finally was able to retool and get involved, and remember, even then the United States was only militarily prepared to start involvement in North Africa and Europe by 1943, okay? And so as a result of that, effectively, yes, the United States obviously fought on the right side of the war. Obviously, the United States, was significantly important. Lend-Lease was probably the biggest contribution to the success of the Allies in World War II. However, the full scale of the destructive human catastrophe, from the Holocaust to a conflict that cost the lives of maybe 50 million people, that really could not be changed because of the delay that isolationism caused for the United States. And so the lessons of Munich for the United States were, do not appease an aggressor. That the United States now had to accept it was a world power. It had to be engaged in the world. It had to be prepared to lead the world when it was needed. And this is the thing that really leads to the development, in the context of the Cold War, the development of very large military budgets, of a highly technologically an economically powerful military-industrial complex in the United States. It is the thing that leads to the United States maintaining and stationing troops and bases all over the world, which it should be noted in the immediate aftermath of World War II, that is not something that was all policymakers accepted. Most American policymakers at the end of World War II assumed the war would be over, Russia would go home, the Soviet Union would go home, there would be rebuilding and advising and decisions would be made on a diplomatic level, but there was no expectation immediately that there would be like permanent installations and that American forces would remain there and that there would be this sort of this global sort of presence that would be in place. But ultimately, in the context of the Cold War, policymakers viewed this as necessary, even if it was potentially problematic. Because the big question, of course, with the military-industrial complex in the United States is how do you sort of have this huge military, which was never like sort of envisioned in the early founding of the country, and prevent the country from sort of being overly influenced by the military side of things. How do you preserve democracy and not become a military garrison state? The Russians actually had their own interpretation of the lessons of Munich, because from the Russian standpoint, right, it might not have come out of Munich itself, but Russia, shortly after this, the Soviet Union, just as Stalin, of course, would form the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact in 1939. And, of course, in 1941, the 22nd of June 1941, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. And this was always part of the plan, and invaded the Soviet Union. And for the communists in the Soviet Union, they had always believed that the West, always since like the founding of the Bolshevik Revolution, they believed that the West was bent on opening up Russia and the Soviet Union to capitalist exploits. From their standpoint, because the Nazis were a fascist movement, they were basically like, if you want to think about it this way, they were an authoritarian sort of, like an authoritarian corporate nationalism in a way, as opposed to a communist state that's like an authoritarian sort of planned economic system. But from their standpoint, because when the Nazis invaded Russia, from their standpoint, they said, you see, this is the West, this is their plan. They're going to always seek to invade and destroy the Soviet experience, the Russian experience. And so the lessons of Munich create these two interpretations that actually create the foundation for the differing perspectives that occur in the Ukraine today. Whether or not the two perspectives are rightly or not, and it should be noted that regardless of which perspective that you have, Putin and Russia in Ukraine are the party at fault. Okay, just as cases of other offensive wars against sovereign countries in the past, it is the aggressor, regardless of the factors that might motivate them to do that. It is the country launching an offensive war that is at fault, the most is fault. So it's really important to not fall victim of that. Oh, you see the expansion of NATO, as we see right here. So therefore, NATO expanded, so Russia was justified in this. Russia's interpretations of the lessons of Munich were coming true, and so therefore it's justified. No, that's not the case. Ultimately, ownership over an offensive war against a sovereign country that has not attacked it or threatened it, that ownership must be on the aggressor. And in that case, it's obviously Russia. But there is an important historical lesson to what's happening here. The United States' lesson. The consequence of being an isolationist in the 1930s, sitting idle by while the most horrific global tragedy occurs, the overrunning, overthrowing, destruction of Western Europe, right? For the United States, this can't happen again. So the United States finally accepts that it has to take a lead in the world. This means you have to be militarily prepared. You have to be engaged. You have to create allies. You have to build up your allies. And you have to use those allies as a way of preserving and advancing the ideals that the Western world holds true. And that's the basic thinking and the idea behind the conflict in Ukraine from the United States' standpoint. It doesn't mean that these are not oftentimes that this sort of forward positioning of the United States is not misplaced. It's just saying that that's the thinking, is that the United States has accepted that it's a global power. The Russian standpoint, you could argue, as you see here, this is NATO during the Cold War, right? And this is the Warsaw Pact, East Germany, and of course the blue countries are the NATO countries. NATO was formed because the lessons of Munich demanded that it appeared the Soviet Union had occupied Eastern Europe. It did not. One of the demands of the United States during World War II was that countries be allowed to form their own sovereign governments. And the Soviet Union obviously prevented that from occurring. And that was one of the things. Now there's other things too. The United States held on to a nuclear monopoly, which was very problematic for the Soviets. But that leads to a standoff, right? And so the United States forms NATO, the Soviet Union forms the Warsaw Pact. And of course, both sides are doing this because of their interpretations of those lessons of Munich. The United States doing it because they see the Soviet Union as the next threat ready to overrun Europe. They see the occupation of Poland, for example, as just evidence of that. And the Soviet Union occupying those countries because they see the lessons of Munich as a threat to the Western intention to destroy the Soviet experiment. When the Soviet Union falls apart in 1991, of course, in the 1990s, the United States would encourage the expansion of NATO. And the expansion of NATO, of course, as Russia, and I don't think the expansion of NATO in the 90s was, there were two sort of major phases to the expansion of NATO, the first being in the 90s and the second in the 2000s. First Bill Clinton and the other George W. Bush, but at least the first one, I would say, it wasn't necessarily done to antagonize Russia. Russia was kind of taken for granted at the time. But when Putin starts to become stronger and tries to seek out what we would naturally perceive his goal probably is to make the Russians a strong world power again. It's certainly, you would see the relevance of the Russian perspective on the lessons of Munich as well, seeing this forward positioning of Western allies as something that is inherently threatening Russia. And so, effectively, the United States is supporting Ukraine because it wishes to oppose an expansion of authoritarianism, because it saw the effect of its isolationism in not countering authoritarianism in the World War II period. The lead up to the World War II period was so catastrophic that the United States determined that it should become a world power, and politicians voted effectively to become a world power in the late 1940s. And the United States has believed that its interests are to oppose aggressive authoritarianism. And so what's happening in Ukraine is on the European continent, and it is, from the U.S. perspective, the most sort of the most poignant example of an aggressive authoritarianism, which demands, in the legacy of the U.S.'s emergence after World War II and the Cold War as a world power, demands that the United States engage that in a very proactive way. And that's, of course, why you have such a huge military budget. That's why you have bases all around the world for the United States. And likewise, the Soviet Union's inherent suspicion, or Russia's inherent suspicion, Putin's inherent suspicion over Western intent on Russia, and a desire, most likely, right, we can't get inside Putin's head necessarily, but almost certainly a desire to make Russia a strong country again, countering, reacting to the Russian perspective on the lessons of Munich, undoubtedly are at work on that side as well. So the longer history here gives us a deeper understanding of what's happening in Ukraine. The United States, as a world power, really following World War II, is really a country, and it's not to say that its power has not been misapplied. American power in the world has been misapplied with terrifying consequences too much. But it doesn't mean that the motivations are always intended to be misapplied, shall we say. The United States reacted from the lessons of Munich. It became a world power, and it sought to effectively secure its interests by promoting American ideals and an American perspective through as much of the world as possible, and using a forward position to defend against aggressive authoritarianism that would threaten that. So understanding that can help us understand more deeply why the United States supports Ukraine in the war. This is Philip Travis, History Changes. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please subscribe on YouTube.